Thank you all very much for joining us. This is our June monthly CISMA webinar. So the Florida Invasive Species Council's Partnership Assistance and Communications Committee, or FISPAC for short, facilitates partnerships that prevent and control the threat of invasive species on public and private lands and waters in Florida. And I'm going to throw a link in the chat real quickly. If you haven't had a chance to fill out this short questionnaire, we're trying to get a little bit of information on everyone's experience with invasive plant management or rare plant management, especially in consideration of invasive plant management here in Florida. And so there's the link there in the chat. We've had the QR code up. But our talk today will be learning about the intersection of invasive plant management and rare species protection. And we've got Jimmy Lange, who's the research botanist for Fairchild Tropical Gardens. And I will go ahead and hand control over to him in a minute. Just a few housekeeping statements. If you can keep yourself muted during the presentation, we'd appreciate that. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat as we go through the presentation, and we'll address those at the very end. And you can send those just to the full group or to me. And we'll go ahead and hand it over to Jimmy now. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb, and hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here to speak with you guys. The reason I had asked Deb to put out this little questionnaire is, I've working with rare plants in South Florida for, well over a decade now. And, we interact with a lot of land managers, of course, to do this. And I'm often pleasantly surprised of how proactive, land managers are with their rare plant populations. But occasionally I visit areas where, land managers aren't tracking their rare plants, and maybe they're not a large consideration of their management. So, I'm hoping I can, maybe fill some of those gaps, talk about a little bit of just provide some background, tell you a bit about my team and just some personal experiences I've had and some kind of thoughts and recommendations. I'm sure most of this will be, kind of old hat to most of you, but bear with me. So yeah, my name is Jimmy Lange, and I'm the research botanist with the conservation program at Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden. Our stated goal is to, reduce the extinction risk of the rare flora of South Florida and the Caribbean. There's a team of, there was 9 of us. As of a few days ago, there's 8 of us. Sam Walsdorf actually just moved to Texas, and we're going to miss her a lot. On top of working with Fairchild, I'm also a research associate with the Institute for Regional Conservation, and I am the co-chair of the Plant List Committee for FISC. Just a bit about our team. We've been doing this for over 40 years. We're one of the oldest plant conservation programs in the country. Our focal groups are cacti. Anyone who knows me knows I love cactus. Jen Posley, my boss, and myself, we're both pretty obsessed with ferns. And a lot of our work also involves pine rockland species, which, as many of you know, it's a very rare, globally imperiled habitat with a lot of rare endemic species. In order to do our job properly, we have close ties with regional land managers, and we specialize in rare plant monitoring. We make management recommendations. We grow rare plants. We reintroduce them into their habitat, and I'll talk a little bit about one of our primary goals is seed banking as well. So though there's sometimes not as much overlap as I would like, there's very much a Venn diagram of land management essentially here, where the plant conservationists are trying to prevent extinctions of native plants, and invasive species biologists are often trying to facilitate extinctions of non-native species. But this is all part of the same kind of broader goal of land management and the stewardship of healthy native ecosystems. So a little bit about, for those of you who maybe aren't as involved in the world of plant conservation, it's fairly straightforward, but I'll provide some background here. It's usually divided into kind of 2 main categories of activities. We have in situ, which is a fancy Latin way of saying on-site, and ex situ or off-site. And I'll talk about some of the differences. As many of you know, and to conserve any plants or animals, kind of the primary thing is land preservation and protection of habitat. Florida has, a large percentage of green spaces. We have a lot of protected land, but there is also protected land that's, can still come under threat. And we're always trying to work with folks to, acquire new conservation properties as often as possible. So one of the first things we do, to kind of understand the rarity of plants and kind of just as like a basic building block is mapping. We want to know where plants are. We want to know how many there are. Otherwise, it's kind of the jumping off point of dealing with that. And from there, we often do monitoring. So we're looking for population trends and drivers of these trends. Are there specific things going on that make our population thrive, like prescribed fire, or, things that make our population suffer? So try to have these kind of data-based tools to, assess what's going on with these species in the field. With that is threat mitigation, which kind of ties into today's talk the most. One of the primary threats of rare species is invasive species. So, mitigating that threat through, not only invasive plants, but other pests, insects, and things that may affect species, trying to fight woody encroachment through prescribed fire and fire surrogates, hydrologic restoration, et cetera, the various threats that, rare plants can face. Another big part of in situ conservation is translocation. So putting plants out into the wild, whether where they haven't existed before, which is an introduction or a reintroduction somewhere they were formerly found, or an augmentation where we, add plants to an existing population to bolster numbers, and where we can bolster genetic diversity. There's also a lot of other just general research that goes into this. In the field, we can study the pollination syndrome of different plant species. So are they obligate crossers or not? What do we need to know about their different pollination limitations and just other limitations to their success? We often look at their demography of, how their populations are structured and how different things impact this. Can they form seed banks? Are there predators that are impacting the seed banks? So a number of factors. Other things we can do in the field is conduct hand pollinations for these things that require obligate crossing, and maybe we find to be, pollinator limited. Sometimes we can rake soils, and certain species like soil disturbance, certain species don't. So just a variety of activities that can take place on site. So ex situ plant conservation, or the offsite aspect of it, is often where botanic gardens come in. So I put in a picture of a breeding program of pandas from China, because this is often what a lot of people think of when they think of ex situ conservation. And botanic gardens are often doing the same thing with plants. We're trying to maintain living individuals, get them to breed with each other, under these nice controlled conditions to where, we can then, collect and bag seeds. So, and this is one of my former students doing hand pollinations of the key tree cactus, one of our federally endangered plants that we work with. So we often kind of separate our living collections into plants versus seeds. In certain plants, their seeds aren't able to be stored, and we refer to these as recalcitrant species. So this is, a lot of tropical, large fruited, large seeded plants, things like, if you think of mango or avocado, palms are recalcitrant. So all of these plants, like if we want to maintain conservation collections of them, we need to physically keep plants alive. But the vast majority of the species we work with are considered orthodox species. And that means that they're tolerant of desiccation, so drying out and then freezing. So we can, if we could dry out and freeze seeds, we can keep them alive for sometimes hundreds of years, taking up very little space. So we could have, thousands of genetic individuals represented in a few small bags in a freezer. So I often consider this kind of the low-hanging fruit of plant conservation. We also have display gardens, which can be important for just education and outreach, making people aware of, sometimes just seeing a species in person can inspire people. So that's part of what we try to do with our living collections. And then we also try to participate in this idea of meta collections. And this is often for recalcitrant species, but we do it with seed banking as well. This is where we'll work with partner institutions from other parts of the state, other parts of the country, other parts of the world. And we can have certain genetic individuals represented at certain institutions, and it's kind of a safeguarding and a backup. And these things also just take up space if you try to have plants in the ground. So if we can have more partners working with that, it's generally beneficial. So a bit more about seed banking. This is a picture of our conservation seed laboratory at Fairchild. And again, as I mentioned, this is a very simple process and it's very cheap. It's very effective. So we often consider it the low-hanging fruit of plant conservation. So we dry seeds just in a desiccator over salt concentrations, and we put them in these sealed foil envelopes and we store them in a regular old lab freezer. So there's literally millions of seeds just in this picture right here of, in that freezer, I know we have several hundred species, so like major backup collections. And I'll mention that we also, particularly for rare species, but we do with most of the species that we store, we also work with the USDA National Seed Bank in Fort Collins. And so we'll send backups of our seeds there, because we never know, things could happen in our lab, a major hurricane. We have backup generators, but we want to prepare for the worst and have things backed up as much as possible. And then so kind of where the rubber meets the road, oftentimes where the kind of in situ work, connects with the ex situ work, is translocation. So we've grown these plants, we've generated diverse genetic material, and now we want to put it back out in the field. So this is one of the major things that we do to bolster rare plant populations. These are some introductions that we've done of the cowhorn orchid and the key tree cactus down in the Keys, which, as you can probably see, a lot of work goes into those outplantings, just transferring the cacti and then getting them buried in the limestone. And so I thought this would be useful. So the Center for Plant Conservation is kind of the central institution for plant conservation institutions to interact, and they fund the national collection. So they'll give money to different institutions to maintain living collections or seed banks of rare species. So as you can see, Florida is very well represented here. We have a lot of people in our state that work with rare plants. So there's probably some near you. And I'll talk a little bit more about this website in general, but again, just some background for folks who aren't from the world of plant conservation. So I want to stress both of these fields are still relatively young. The study of biological invasions and just invasion ecology in general didn't really start until about 1958, when Charles Sutherland Elton published his famous work on the ecology of invasions. And if you guys don't know of Charles Elton, he was really kind of a preeminent figure, mainly in animal ecology, but he developed a lot of these early kind of networks and food ideas about food webs. And through studying, the kind of connectivity and the interactions of different organisms, really was what led to this understanding of how invasive plants are impacting ecosystems. So again, 1958. So we're just, a few generations into this. We're on a similar timeline with rare species. After the Endangered Species Act, the first animals were listed in 1967. And it wasn't until a decade later, in 1977, when 4 endemic plants to the San Clemente Islands were the first listed plants. These are in California. And then in 1984, we had some of our first Florida listings of the key tree cactus and Torreya. in 85, we had a lot of the pine rockland endemics got listed, things like scrub mints and other kind of Lake Wales Ridge endemics. And there's kind of a smattering of listings over the years. And it was interesting, like there wasn't a figure that existed like this online. So I kind of had to put it together year by year. And it was interesting to see which you could tell certain regional offices made a big push in a given year. So like this major 1994 push was mostly Hawaiian plants. And it was just kind of cool going through all that and seeing. But one thing that might stand out to you from this figure is that, the majority of listed species, 55.8%, are plants. And we have 54 endangered species in the US and 15 threatened species. And in the state of Florida, we have about 380. I don't know if this number may have been updated by a species or two, but about 380 state endangered species and about 117 state threatened species. And the difference there, again, this is probably, sophomoric for most of you, but, federally listed species is generally speaking endemic to the US and threatened with extinction. So losing the plant in the US would likely mean extinction. And it's a similar approach to state listed species, but just within the state. So sometimes, in the Florida Panhandle, for example, we have some species that are more widespread in the coastal plain or, into the Midwest even, but they're very rare in the state of Florida. So we still don't want to lose them there. So they wouldn't qualify for federal listing because maybe they're, on NatureServe a G5, but they might be very rare in Florida. And it's similar with a lot of our South Florida rare plants that are, found elsewhere in the Caribbean, but are maybe known to just have a handful of populations here in Florida. But I saw this news. A lot of you have probably seen this. This is a few weeks ago. This is going to be our newest endangered species. The ghost orchid was recently proposed. There's a 60-day comment period if anyone wants to weigh in on that. And this one was an interesting test of some of those rules where it's not endemic to Florida. It's also found in Cuba. So listing species that are also found in other countries is often not done, but there was a lot of research that folks in Florida did, working in collaboration with folks in Cuba to identify that, the majority of the plants are in Florida and the populations in Cuba are not doing so hot. So, losing this species in the US, would be, very likely to cause extinction in the long term for the species. That's pretty good news. So a little bit more about the listings of plants. This is a study by Vivian Negron-Ortiz, who's with the Fish and Wildlife Service. She works in the office up in the Panhandle, and she actually used to work at Fairchild a couple decades ago. But she did the first kind of study of patterns of expenditures towards plant conservation. And I'll kind of pull you over to these charts on the right. So the number of listed species, as you can see, of plants here, far outweighs the other groups, but the funding per species is far lower than any other group. And not to say that this is bad. Obviously, it's a very different animal dealing, no pun intended, dealing with plants versus animals. But I also want to point out here that on the y-axis, this isn't necessarily to scale. So we have sometimes the equivalent of, 75,000 per species here, whereas, fish are often getting 5 million per species. So just drastically different. And so the first major assessment was done by David Wilco of just, how are rare plants doing in the United States? So these federally listed species, what are the threats they're facing? And he was out of Princeton, if I remember correctly. But he found, which, kind of not surprising, that habitat loss was the single greatest threat to biodiversity, but followed by the spread of alien species. So again, this was, not too long after, the formation of FLEPC. We're still kind of, in the burgeoning years of invasive species management. So these were very important findings. They found that 30% of imperiled plants in the US were threatened by invasive species. They also identified a number of other threats, 20% of plants affected by changes in fire ecology, et cetera. So there was a follow-up to this study done by some folks at the University of Missouri. So this was about 20 years later. And they basically found similar patterns, similar threat levels. But one thing is they tried to do a little more in terms of how are these threats kind of related to one another. And one of their major take-homes from this was that threats form this idea of a mega syndrome, where it's not like a single threat impacting, a given rare plant species. It's, habitat loss, which led to woody encroachment or fire suppression and invasive species and hydrologic modifications, that it's just this variety of symptoms, and so they really called for, this integrated coarse and fine scale. So coarse of like, let's focus on the number one thing, let's, acquire and protect the land that we have, but all the way down to, fine scale things like spot treatment of invasive species around the rare plants. So they've made some comparisons, like they found that when they did the initial analyses that Hawaii was just kind of this outlier. So they often looked at it differently from the rest of the US. But you can see here on average, somewhere around, I think it was 27% of rare species are threatened by invasive species. But I was surprised that the number one threat was recreation. So this included hiking and people going off trail and trampling. But when they looked a little closer at the data, the vast majority of it was tied to off-road vehicles. And so they didn't provide this table in the paper, but I put it together because I thought it was useful, because they did do an analysis where they separated species status assessments into these, because they don't all happen on the same years. They just separated into these clumps of years. There was 96 to 02, and then 03 to 08, and then 09 to 2014. And they looked at how these assessments identified threats over time. And this is one of the things that, really stood out to me from this study, was that, the invasive species, the threats to rare species more than doubled. So like 1.25x over less than 20 years. Recreation really seemed to increase. And whether that's that recreation increase or just documentation of it, it can be the same thing with invasive species. So again, a lot of these things, it's a young field. We're still, 40, 50 years in terms of ecology isn't necessarily a long time to really understand, how things are changing. Some things we can see right away, but other things, we, take more time. But another thing that stood out to me was that housing and urban development had stayed kind of similar. So at least in terms of our federally imperiled plants, seems like most of them are protected from kind of urban development. But again, when we're looking at these threats, everyone's probably seen this invasion curve, where, impacts and cost of invasive species just kind of compound over time. And I just wanted to put this up because I think this goes for a lot of these other threats too, in terms of, again, fire suppression, hydrologic modification. Oftentimes the effects of these things, hit some tipping point. We often have like some form of positive feedback loop, which often loops back into invasive species. But just to say that, as over time, as we're observing these things, we often observe more impacts if action isn't taken. So I thought this was another really great take home from this study. So this figure is looking at the prevalence of research into these threats to rare species. And kind of the vertical line in the middle is kind of a demarcation point of things that go to the right of it with a value greater than 1. They're having way too much research put into them, and things that, are not getting enough research relative to their threat were less than 1. And so these, the 6 primary threats to rare species are not being studied enough. And we're putting too many resources into studying missing species and pollinators and some of these other ecological interactions, pathogens and disease, logging, climate change. But one thing I'll mention here is it's tricky to study the effects of invasive plants on rare species because we tend to not let it happen, or at least do our best to not let it happen. It's often not worth it to have, a control plot where we just let a population get completely overrun with, Brazilian pepper or what have you. So I think that's part of the discrepancy here in terms of invasive species. And I think probably, with the missing species, it's just, they're just cool ecological studies. I'm actually going to highlight a couple of them here. So this is some work from Basket et al. In 2011, and they were working with an endangered plant, Cirsium pitcheri, which is found on the dunes of Lake Michigan. And it's an endemic thistle plant, if you guys don't know Cirsium. And there's another invasive species there, baby's breath. There's a number of invasive species in that region, but they were looking at baby's breath, which is a Caryophyllaceae, Gypsophila paniculata. And they were looking at how that species was affecting pollinator communities and then how that was impacting rare plants. So kind of like these indirect effects of invasive species. So for one, they noticed pollinator abundance was increased by the invasion of this species. So in some ways, we're like, oh, cool, more insects, more pollinators. And they noticed this particularly in groups with the sweat bees and the hoverflies, the Halictidae and the Syrphidae. But then they were looking at pollinator visitors to this endemic thistle, and it was actually, the invasions, despite the pollinator communities going up, the actual, the pollinator visitations to this rare species were actually going down. And even after removal, there were still impacts. They were marginally significant, but things could be improved with removal of this invasive species. They also found that removal of the invasive increased native plant richness. And one thing, they were finding all of these pollinators, but they also found a drastic increase in interspecific pollen transfer. So a lot of plants were getting the wrong pollen because there was just a lot of these generalist pollinators that were visiting, several different flower species, but not necessarily effectively pollinating. So this is interesting, but then I think it got really cool because with rare plants, we often look for results like this. This is like what people want to see. So this is, gosh, what is Vit's name? But she's out of Chicago Botanic Garden. They published this paper in 2020. And basically on the left here, if you look at these different columns, plants are on the left and insect species are on the right. And they're looking at pollinator interactions. So these two show the Cirsium pitchii, the endemic. And during June and July, it's just really dominating pollinator interactions. Whereas in August, a non-native species is dominating the interactions. And so looking at which insects were using what, they were able to determine how many pollinator species would go extinct with the loss of other given species. And so with this federally endangered endemic, they found that it was supporting, a large percentage of the pollinator community in these habitats. So sometimes we may lose up to 10 species in these areas if we lose that plant. So it just kind of further call for the management of these invasives. But then, because it's never simple in ecology, the species with asterisks here are invasive plants, and they found that, one of the honeysuckles and one of the stone crops were also supporting pretty large pollinator communities. So it's complex. But again, this is like a really fantastic paper, a really fun study. It gets cited all the time. So it's kind of makes sense that, so many resources go into studies like this because they're just cool. But it goes to show that we don't always understand the direct and indirect effects of both invasions and the control of these invasions. So that's kind of where I'll leave it with background, and then I'll just get into a little more of like my personal experience and, some thoughts and recommendations for folks here. And I hope we have time to kind of, have kind of an open-ended discussion, and, you guys can share some of your experiences and your thoughts. But again, I'll mention the Center for Plant Conservation. And if any of you are land stewards or just biologists that maybe want to get into protecting species and maybe don't know where to start, they have this free workshop, the Rare Plant Academy. It's an assortment of videos and documents of best practices and, how to choose a monitoring protocol and, how to collect seeds and this and that. And just a lot of resources. So I just wanted to share that with you all. And now I'll get into, some of my personal experiences and the actual kind of overlap that I see in my world. And I'll start with some of the collaborations that we do with the USDA ARS lab in Davie. Their lab is primarily focused on developing biological control agents for our invasive plants. And we often provide plants to them for their feeding trials. So when they're trying to clear an insect, to get past this rigorous testing standard, they have to do these feeding trials with sometimes hundreds of species to make sure that, these insects that they introduce as biocontrol agents won't have kind of non-target effects on other native plants or even other ornamentals. So we often provide them with rare species and other native plants that we're already growing. So this is just another great use of our, utilizing our conservation collections of these plants that we're already growing to help get these biological control agents across the finish line. Then obviously we're interested in knowing, confirming that these various insects will not eat our rare plants. And Greg Wheeler and I, he's actually currently working on a biocontrol agent for Kogan grass, which I'm sure a lot of you will be excited about. And we're going to be hopefully working together if all the funding comes through. And I'm going to help him collect native grasses all over Florida and the Southeast to set up some more of these feeding trials. So really looking forward to that. Oh, and I should mention that their group also helps us. We do kind of annual work days of Tectaria incisa. It's an invasive fern that we have here that, is one of the primary threats to so many of our rare native ferns. And they've been kind of instrumental in helping us control this species because we try not to use herbicide in these habitats, at least as little as possible. So this was an interesting case that, to me, this is where this intersection really often exists, and it's often kind of messy. But so in 2018, we found a population of a new species to the US, a new fern species in the genus Coneopterus. And interestingly, it was only found on this limestone outcrop under a very dense infestation of Brazilian pepper. And as most of you know, a lot of these ferns, especially a lot of the lithophytes, they like kind of a lot of shade, high humidity conditions, and there wasn't any other canopy in the area providing those conditions. So then it becomes, we have to kind of adapt our management strategy away from, just treating all of the invasives at the site. And again, some of this probably seems like common sense, but, it's still just this is all part of it. So one of the first thing we did, we worked on collecting spores so that we could grow more of these plants to, again, have kind of material backed up. And so after a few years, because it takes a while to grow ferns from spore, we outplanted a number of individuals. We established a healthy population in a non-infested area in good habitat. And then, so once that, again, several years later, once that starts, we wanted to start trying to remove some of this invasive canopy. Even growing amongst the Brazilian pepper, there's a lot of Schefflera. These are actually pictures from another site, but this was a lesson that we learned in Miami-Dade. So Schefflera, or Heptapleuron, the umbrella tree, really grows, puts roots out all over the rocks, puts down a ton of very thick leaf litter that takes a long time to decompose. So that we've witnessed a lot of negative impacts from this species to rare fern populations. But then if you can see on the right here, if we try to just remove the trees, then we remove kind of the growing conditions that these ferns like. So it's kind of this catch-22 of how much standing dead can we leave? We don't want to remove everything at once. So we took this kind of controlled approach at this site where the Goniopterus was found. And so one thing we do is, I kind of map off and flag off these really sensitive areas. So these are the track logs from our contractors. And you can see that there were, certain rare fern hotspots that we just have them stay out of. Some of which there's just not enough invasives in there to worry about. Some of the ones like this little patch here, there's a ton of invasives, but we wanted to kind of work through it a little more slowly and methodically. So we started doing some, experimental clearing of just kind of portions of the habitat, and we're monitoring what's happening with the ferns. And, we kind of just want to kind of go in segments, let some canopy grow back in before we remove the rest. So it's a little bit of a process, but we're still just trying to learn how much light, how much, kind of low humidity conditions can these plants tolerate. It's seeming like it's more than we thought. So we probably won't be as careful moving forward in terms of removing this canopy. But again, this is just some of the considerations we're making in our management decisions. Another species that we work a lot with is the beech Jacomannia reclinata. This is a species in the morning glory family with these beautiful, pretty white flowers. It's kind of a sprawling vine that grows in kind of stabilized dunes in barrier islands of southeastern Florida. And it likes a lot of sunlight. It's a heliophyte. And the primary threat to these populations, obviously, a lot of the back dune habitat is now condos and roads. So habitat loss, as usual, is the main thing. But of the remaining habitat, woody encroachment, particularly of native species, like sea grape is one of our biggest enemies with this species. Some of the problems that we deal with. So we got a small grant from Fish and Wildlife called Restoring Habitat Heterogeneity of Coastal Plant Communities for Beech Jacomannia. And so, I generally don't advocate for single species management, but, in this case, these conditions that favor Beech Jacomannia, these kind of somewhat, some open sand, herbaceous plant communities, often, they favor several other plant species and pollinators. Versus the kind of monocultural type habitat we get with things like sea grape and coin vine. So this is just one site. We did projects all over the Southeast, but we're clearing areas of beech scaevola. And once we kill the plants, we're actually removing the biomass. And we're doing follow-up treatments to kind of like reestablish these areas of open dune. And in the next couple months, this is probably 6 months ago or so, these photos. And in the next few months, we're going to be, outplanting Jacomannia and a number of other kind of diverse native plants into these habitats to kind of try to regain some of this habitat. So another kind of major effort with this grant was trying to reintroduce fire in some of the coastal strand habitat that has enough habitat and is, far enough away from development where we can execute it. And so these photos are from Crandon Park, which is the largest remaining population of Jacomannia in the wild. And we were really excited to get a prescribed fire out here because the coastal strand was getting overrun with palmettos and just other kind of woody shrubs, which again, it's all part of the dynamics of the system, but historically these habitats would burn. So we were really excited to, we did a bunch of fuel prep. We got fire on the ground out there. We had a really successful burn. Then after the fire, though, this Madagascar periwinkle just absolutely exploded. And this is a species that I'm sure a lot of you have dealt with in some degree or another that generally seems relatively benign in the landscape, seems a little more aggressive in coastal communities. But because at least down here, we so rarely do prescribed fire in these coastal communities, we were really surprised by the absolute explosion of this species. And so we brought contractors out to kind of spray where we didn't have rare plants. We shared the maps with them and we're flagging plants. This is Antonio Rodriguez from works for Palm Beach County. Absolutely one of the best contractors and invasive species biologists out there. I can't say enough. but when we're working directly around, the very sensitive rare plants where we don't want to spray a bunch of herbicides, we resorted to hand pulling. And so we brought volunteer groups out, mainly students, and we were able to pull out dozens and dozens of bags of this stuff directly around the rare plants and benefit the species. So again, just kind of like a shift in management strategies from just going out and spraying everything, to, just having to get a little more nuanced around all these rare plants. And so just some general recommendations for my end. It kind of just goes for everybody who does this. Get out there and botanize, learn to identify native plants and non-native plants. I often work with folks that can know all the big invasives like the back of their hand, which is, absolutely critical also. But sometimes, just from an appreciation standpoint, they're not recognizing the things that they're actually working to protect. Especially with some of the rare, more sensitive species, that when we can identify them, when we have extra, eyes in the field, we can ultimately have better outcomes. And then I think people just enjoy their time in the field more when the more they know about the ecosystems they're working in. And this is, again, where I don't know enough about where everyone is at and what they do, but if you have the opportunity to connect with local rare plant experts, as I showed that map, there's institutions all over the state. We have a ton of botanical expertise in our state. And any chance you can get, if you can map rare species. I was over on some folks on the West Coast, and I was surprised that they didn't map their listed species at all. So I kind of set them up with a program to where they could do so. And even if you can't map, if put out some pin flags or some flagging tape, just if you have contractors out, they're like, hey, stay away from the red flags. Simple little things. But again, very, very cheap and easy. And again, always, if you do know where your rare plants are, if you have any, identify the potential threats, because sometimes it's different species that might affect rare plants than the typical kind of large invasives that we're used to working with, and we should at least try to consider the direct and indirect impacts of removals. So I meant my example with this rare fern, where if we just, remove the canopy of invasive species, we've eliminated really our rare fern habitat. Just despite having this great limestone rock features, it's no longer the conditions that these plants need. So finding that balance of getting rid of these species over time, or finding other places, other habitats that they can live, and collecting seeds, and sharing with local seed banks. Collecting seeds is so cheap and easy. My group would be willing to help and walk people through that. If you're doing a big removal, especially if there might be rare plants in the area, back up some seeds ahead of time, just in case, herbicide drips, and, we're all really careful, but it's always good to have backups of these things anyway. And again, they can last hundreds of years. And at least the way we work, if you are land manager, you provide seeds to us, you own them, and you just ask for them back whenever you want. So I just, want to promote that kind of partnership for those of you who maybe don't have it. And then further in, again, just with the couple things I talked about, and I'm sure most of you do this already, but develop strategies for your sensitive habitat. You might be dealing with different invasive species, quote unquote. I just have a photo down here of Hemigraphis reptans. That's, there's almost no wild populations, so it's certainly on a geographic scale, not an invasive plant, but it grows, and it really is this prostrate little herb that loves limestone, and it's kind of directly competing with a lot of our rare ferns, and preventing gametophyte establishment and these various things. So it might be some tiny plant, that you can see like Pilia microphylla here too. It's another thing that really disrupts rare fern populations. But most of us, when we think of invasive species management, we're not necessarily thinking on that scale. But sometimes we need to, because even if we look at the definitions of, category 1 species, having impacts on rare species, regardless of, the geographic extent and the size of the plant. So again, just something to consider. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, if you're developing these strategies, and again, obviously resources are limited, but if you can develop some metrics of success, like if you can monitor these plants and these activities that we've been doing are causing a spike in flowering, or we're getting more seedlings or less seedlings. Maybe we should pull back on our activities. So just these various things to consider. And also just life history. You know, a lot of times just our eyes, we want to treat, you know, invasive species when they look bad. But I put a photo up of the longclaw orchid, Ultraplectris calcarata. There's a population of this species that I work with that if you walk out in the habitat, it looks like a relatively pristine natural area, but you walk around, you see lots of little saplings of invasive plants like carrotwood and schefflera and these various things. So again, if you're just walking by and comparing it to sites nearby where there's Brazilian pepper everywhere or what have you, you know, it may not seem like it's as bad, but we don't want this system to get that bad. So we may want to treat these things at, you know, at a different life stage, maybe hand pulling versus using chemical, you know. Again, probably seems very obvious to most of you, but kind of worth mentioning. I believe that was it for my presentation. So I'd love to kind of just open the floor to questions and conversations, see the result of the doodle poll. So thank you for having me.
Oh, it's fantastic, Jimmy. Thank you very much.
Oh,
We don't have any questions in the chat, so I will real quickly go ahead and share the results from that poll, and we can see if there's any other questions. Can you guys see the screen okay? Yep. All right, so we got 15 responses, and about a third of the people often, I know this is kind of small, let me see if I can make it a bit bigger so you guys can see. Oh, that did not work at all, sorry. That might be a happy medium. So just, yeah, down here on the bottom, you can see we had about a third of people that often and half occasionally treat and manage invasive nuisance plants in rare plant habitat. Vast majority of people are at least occasionally interacting with rare plant conservation experts. As far as the consideration that people are giving to their rare plants and their invasive plant management, we're equally divided all the way across those three categories. But most of us do think that we need to put more emphasis on managing and protecting the rare plants and their habitats as we consider our invasive plant management. So we know that we need to kind of put a little bit more towards this. And we're middle of the road again too on how confident we feel with identifying the rare plants in our region. So, you know, we got a whole breadth across of experience across there. And
I would warn there, just from my personal experience, the more I learn, the more I realize the less I know.
Yep. And we all want to learn more. So yeah, I think we're in a decent position and headed towards having some more. So we'll stop sharing on that and seeing if we have any questions.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks for doing that, Deb. I think we lost someone.
Yeah. We're not hearing any questions, don't have anything in the chat. That was, yeah, really good information. I found it very informative, love the tips that you provide there. And we've got your contact information. If you have any questions or concerns later on, if you need some tips, don't hesitate to reach out to Jimmy. And I'm going to go ahead and share again and just give a quick update on kind of the FISPAC and CISMAs, the things that we have coming up across the state. So lots of great events still going on. You know, we're in the heat of summer. Things are really starting to get bad out there, but we still have people out doing work days. So really got to hand it out to our CISMAs, to our groups across the state, the dedication that we have to invasive species management. So several work days. We've got a few different virtual meetings coming up through across the state. Also want to highlight the other things. We've got the Everglades CISMA Invasive Species Coordination meeting is coming up in the middle of July. Registration is available for that. And into July and even into August, more work days and trainings that are going on. As far as announcements for everyone, the Florida, the FISC CISMA grant is accepting proposals through this Friday. You can see more about that. And we've got 3 job postings. I will try to get those links posted in the chat. in just a second so that you can look at those. This one that we've got, this top one with the environmental specialist, I believe is closing fairly soon. So look at those, put in an application or share those with any people that you think would be interested. Then continuing on and looking at the rest of the CISMA calls that we have for this year. So very excited about what we have going on next month in July. Hear about a really innovative project that the FNA is doing with the Florida Park Service. And then another great topic in August that actually kind of ties in a lot to what we're talking about today with fair plant conservation. We'll hear about updates to EPA's herbicide strategy. And most of that is looking at agricultural herbicides first. It will start impacting us in natural areas. And that's really looking at how herbicides can impact our endangered species. So there's going to be some big changes to some substantial changes to kind of labeling and how that all works as we come up in the next few years. So that's good to keep aware of and have on your radar before those changes are seriously impacting our work out there. And so that wraps up our call for today. All these calls are posted up on our YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch this later on, bring for reference. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any questions or concerns, and hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Dave.